Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So, as per the request, I'll just clarify because we did speak briefly after Shira also, and I just wanted to use this as a chance to clarify. We're not going to spend too long on Rav Gaon because we do need to move on. But Rav Gaon in his Sefer Yetzirah, his commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, he treats the Sefer Yetzirah as an ancient work. He understands it perhaps to be Mishnaic era origin, though according to tradition containing truths that go back to the time of Amrom. And Sefer Yetzirah can be understood on a number of levels. It's learnt in later history as a Kabbalistic work. Rav Gaon takes it as a philosophical work and argues that whilst Sefer Yetzirah buys in to some of the Platonic or Pythagorean thought, in the sense that it understands God as creating the world through abstract constants or abstract concepts that seem to have some absolute existence. Moshel lemar hadavadoma, to make this to sort of understand this idea, we can talk about that as being a number, for example. So the number 4 seems to have an independent existence of time and space. If we describe something eternal as being beyond time and space, having absolute existence, objective existence, then number 4 in some level or other would qualify for that. Rav Gaon says that Sefer Yetzirah is open to that idea, but only in the sense that, of course, even that is created by God. So we can accept some of these Pythagorean or Neoplatonic ideas of the physical reality being a shadow of concepts which are deeper and somehow more real than the physical reality. And these have a deeper existence. They exist in a more full, true sense than physical reality. Physical reality is contingent. Any particular table can be created, can exist, and then can wear out and die. Any particular table only exists in one particular time and space, made of a particular material, in a particular shape, whereas the concept table is, in a sense, more real and more eternal than all of those. But even concepts are themselves created, and in some ways we can think of them as the channel through which God operates. And in so doing, Rav Gaon seems to be countering one option, which is in a sense an anti-philosophical option, that we can't say anything meaningful about creation, and on the other hand countering an alternative option in which God is driven out of the system. And Rav Gaon is basically arguing, as did many other who followed Rav Gaon, again we're talking about the first well-known Jewish philosopher, perhaps the first from philosopher in a sense, and he's arguing that we can in a way have our cake and eat it. We can both be rationalists and understand creation in a philosophical sense. We shouldn't just surrender and say we know nothing about creation, and on the other hand, we shouldn't, God forbid, think that our scientific or philosophical understanding of creation and the mechanism through which creation operates denies God his existence. And I want to emphasize there are current philosophies that literally dabble with some of these ideas, very, very similar to some of these ideas of Rav Gaon. So no one serious nowadays is a Pythagorean, but the idea that behind the universe lies a set of laws of science which somehow have a reality beyond the physical universe is quite widely accepted. The idea that the universe can be thought of as information, that when you dig really deep down to a quantum mechanical level, you get to algorithms, you get to information, and then there's something about the laws of science. You may speak to a scientist who says the laws of science let's say an atheistic scientist, who says the laws of science explain all of existence. You say, well, where are these laws of science? Where do they exist? Like, show me to them. Where are they written? And the answer is that he doesn't mean, of course, that they're written, or she doesn't mean that they're written. They mean that they are somehow existing in an abstract conceptual sense and somehow have within themselves causative power. So it's not that far off these ideas of Plato and the Pythagoreans. Very, very interesting to ascribe, if we think of godliness or religion as being motivated by the desire to connect to something beyond fragile human existence and something that has absolute existence, that the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, and scientists, many scientists today are finding that, or in a sense, seeing spiritual or religious value in these abstract entities. And Rav Gaon says in a certain careful respect, we can go with that. Of course, we can believe in abstract concepts, Platonic forms, as having a more absolute existence than our physical existence, and thus, in a sense, being the channel of existence. But God forbid, we shouldn't think that they themselves are the first cause. Behind them lies a first cause, which is God. So that's an attempt to sort of summarize in simple terms what we said last week, and does that clarify? Yeah.
Because when it's when so just at the traffic lights on Grove Street.
Yes.
You came up to the point about when God writes the Torah.
Yes.
He demarcates everything in grade, grade 1, grade 2,
Yes.
grade 3. So where does that concept come from?
Okay, I didn't go into the issues of the days of creation, the age of the universe. I didn't discuss any of that. This gets us into another realm of science and philosophy. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim arguably understands the days of creation to tie into this idea to conceptual stages of creation. To the best of my knowledge, Rav Gaon doesn't go that far. Doesn't go down that path. Okay. I want to just mention very briefly one other work of Rav Gaon, and we won't go into this in depth. I think I may have mentioned it, but just for the sake of thoroughness, it's just amazing how much one person produced. Rav Gaon was just such a towering figure. He also produced a translation stroke commentary on Tanakh. Certainly the Chumishei Torah and various other books. We know of his translation on Yeshaya, on Tehillim, on Mishli, on Iyov, on Eicha, on Esther, on Daniel, so chunks of Nach and the whole of Chumishei Torah. It's a work of translation, slightly commentary. All translation is slightly commentary into Judeo-Arabic, which, as we mentioned, he spoke. He's in the era when the Jewish world is transitioning from Aramaic to Arabic. It's very influential. It's still studied to this day in certain communities. It reflects his rationalist philosophy. So translation will drift towards rationalism. You may say, how can translation drift towards rationalism? Well, when you translate some of the anthropomorphisms in the Torah, the hands of God, the presence of God, and so on, how you translate that indicates how you're understanding these ideas. And it's also philological. It's advanced philologically. He engages in analysis of words and language development. He writes it for a number of purposes. It's so that Jews can learn Torah. Jews who are only Arabic speaking can learn Torah, and it's also to answer Karaite and Muslim criticism of Jews for our interpretation of Torah. So don't forget, the Karaites are flourishing. They only believe in Torah itself. They argue that much of Torah Sheba'al Peh is a distortion of the written Torah. And part of his aim is to show that if you understand and translate the written Torah properly, then many of the ideas of Torah Sheba'al Peh can already be found hinted at in the written Torah. As a piece of trivia, I think it's the first time you find in rabbinic literature the word giraffe. So he translates we're coming up to these pashas. There's the zemer, the animal zemer, and he argues it's a giraffe based upon the Septuagint and other sources, and he translates it as al-giraffa, which I'm told is the Arabic word. I don't speak Arabic, which I'm told is the Arabic word for giraffe. Okay, so we move on from Rav Gaon. I hope I've tried to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope of this giant's achievements. It's just, the mind boggles, absolutely incredible. Okay. I want to sadly move to the closing era of the Geonim, and I want to speak about a set of Mechatonim and their son-in-law. So we have, giving the game away, the last major Gaon we're going to look at in some detail is Rav Gaon, the famous Rav Gaon. He has a father of Sherira Gaon and a father-in-law of Shmuel Chofni Gaon. Okay, yes. So we're now moving towards the 900s to 1000s. Rav Gaon dies in 1038. Rashi is born in 1040. So we're really talking about the last days of the Geonim. There is an overlap between the last of the Geonim and the first of the Rishonim. So the last of the Geonim, Rav Gaon has a couple of successors who are far less prominent than him. We'll get to all of those. But by the time the last of the Geonim operates, you already have these flourishing Torah communities in Germany, in France, in Spain, in North Africa, and in Italy. I spoke at the beginning of the Gaonic Shea about the transition from the close of Gomorrah and the Savaraim into the Geonim, and we'll come back to that actually interestingly today. And now when we're looking at the transition from the Geonim into the Rishonim, there's much that we don't understand. We don't fully understand what led to the decline of the Geonim, and we don't understand how the extra Gaonic places, the places outside the Gaonim, became such strong Makonos HaTorah so quickly. So there's much that we don't understand. But basically speaking, between the year 950 and 1050, the Gaonic academies go into serious decline. They go out with a blaze, Rav Hai Gaon, a staggering figure. But nonetheless, straight after his death, they really end. And at the same time, very quickly, vibrant centers of Torah learning arise in North Africa, in France, in Germany, in Spain, and the very first teachers in these places call themselves Gaon. They take for themselves the Gaonic title. They're not Gaonim in how academics would understand the term, or how history has understood the term as being Babylonian-centered Rosh Yeshivas, but the Rosh Yeshivas of the big academies in Germany and in North Africa found to say, we're Gaon of our yeshivas now. We've created yeshivas outside Bavel that have Gaonim with the Rosh Yeshivas. So for a short time, the Rosh Yeshivas of these academies outside Bavel in faraway North Africa and in cold Germany, Chachmei Magnentia, the yeshivas of Mainz that I think I mentioned when we were looking at the origins of Rashi, they call themselves Gaon. And there's this sudden flourishing of Torah in these areas. And we don't really understand how Torah moved so fast, but it did. There is in history, there's a number of generally in theories, when you see extraordinary history events, one of the theories known as well, it's classically known as the great man theory. Probably nowadays would call it the great person theory. But historically, for better or for worse, it was generally a man. The great man theory is that you have some great figure that creates a major shift in time in history, and one great figure can completely shift the sweep of Jewish history. So I don't know, if we ask ourselves, how can Ashkenaz have become such a central Mokum Torah so quickly in such speed? Well, it's because one great person landed there. You had Rabbeinu Gershom, Ur HaGola, you had Rashi, and out of that you have this sudden Mokum Torah emerges. I personally, and I think many reputable historians don't buy into that. I'm not a historian, I'm just trying to read, but I don't think it's a reasonable explanation. You can and certainly gain from having a great person who can make a significant change, but you need the groundwork to have been laid, and it's very hard for one great person to sort of great doesn't mean you approve of the person, right? So I don't know, if we look at the rise of Nazism, would that have happened without a Hitler? Perhaps not. You need a great figure, an influential figure, but you also need the environment to be right for it. He couldn't have achieved what he achieved. I don't mean achievement in a positive way, God forbid, but he couldn't have done what he did without much groundwork, without societal and cultural and historical and economic circumstances to have allowed that to occur. So for great yeshivas to have suddenly arisen, let's say in Germany, for the yeshiva of Mainz to have arisen, it's not enough just to have one outstanding figure. You need a whole cheder system, you need a yeshiva katana system, you need a yeshiva katana system, you need a whole apparatus of mass education to produce a few phenomenal scholars. Phenomenal scholars don't emerge from nowhere. Statistically, the Gemara says, you can have 1,000 going in and one coming out in any educational system who's an outstanding person. So this transition from, let's say, 950 to 1050 is unclear. How the Gaonic went in. We know roughly the circumstances. There's economic reasons why the Geonim go into decline. There's economic circumstances that lead to the rise of North Africa and Spain and the Rhinelands. We spoke about this when we spoke about Rashi. Maybe the rise of Torah in these other places contributes to the fall of the Geonim because they're no longer sending money and support there. So we know lots of little iterative things that take place, but we don't really have a holistic picture of how such a massive radical change happens so quickly. Either way, though, in direct answer to the question, we're now in the years, we're moving into this transition period from 950 to 1050, and we're learning the last of the Geonim. And the last sort of three very significant names, there are others, and I'll mention them, are the father-in-law of Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Shmuel bar Chofni, and father of Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Sherira Gaon, and Rav Hai Gaon himself, the son-in-law. And these are the last two generations of very, very influential, powerful Geonim before the Geonate goes into permanent, it disappears completely. So let's speak first of all about the less well-known Rav Shmuel bar Chofni. So he is the father-in-law of Rav Hai Gaon. We're talking about born 969, died 1034. So Rav Hai Gaon dies only a few years later, but he's considered in a sense a generation later. And we know very little about him. He is the Gaon of Sura in Babylonia. And Sura by then has gone into decline. He is again indicating the shifts of the center of gravity from Bavel to elsewhere. It's probable he comes from a family in North Africa, in Fez. That's probably his origins. His father is perhaps the Av based in Fez, and he's a promising Talmud, and he gets sent by the family to go and learn in the yeshivas in Bavel. So he's already, like Saadia, he's already an outsider to the Babylonian system. And he, as I mentioned, is the father-in-law of Rav Gaon. He serves as the Gaon of Sura. He does have successors who take over after him, who are the also the Geonim of Sura, but they are really I can't. These are great figures, but they're not. They don't impact significantly in history. He's the last sort of impactful Gaon. Now, amongst the last of the impactful Geonim. Now, we said that Geonim generally, the Torah they produce are not systematic. They don't produce systematic works. They produce responsa to Shuvas. And the systematic works we have from the era of the Geonim are from figures who, for whatever reason, weren't Geonim or weren't active Geonim. So, for example, the BeHa we mentioned, the Halachos Gedolos, is written by an author who, for political reasons, doesn't get appointed as a Gaon, even though he's the outstanding leader of his generation. And therefore, he doesn't get the responsa, which in a way means that he's saved from the pressures of running yeshiva and fundraising and answering to Shuvas, and therefore can write a systematic work. Shmuel Chofni is a Rosh Yeshiva. He has financial pressures on him, and we have letters in the Kariates of him fundraising, of him appealing for money. But the decline of the Gaonit and the decline of Sura means that he is getting less responsa than Gaonim traditionally get. He's getting less questions from Bavel and the diaspora, and therefore he has time to write systematic works. He does write many important responsa. He writes about tons of things. He writes about tefillin and tzitzis and Shabbos and the role of women and kashrus and kohanim and servants and property rights and so on. But a lot of what he writes is systematic. He wrote halachic works. For example, a work on Hilchos Brachos, Shari Bracha. He wrote an introduction to the Talmud, which was learnt very significantly, and other things. So he writes treaties rather than responsa. So he has a 10-chapter systematic work on tzitzis, for example. So I just want to emphasize this is sort of a new genre. Gaonim normally are just writing responsa, whereas he doesn't. He writes sort of systematic halachic works. He writes halachic work on bar mitzvah, on attaining majority, adulthood in halacha, and how that works. He writes on divorce, on Hilchas Gittin. He writes on taxes and taxation in halacha. 20 chapters on Hasagas Gvul and boundary disputes, Hilchas Chiras, contracts, gifts. So he's writing halachic monographs or even full-length books rather than just writing responsa. And in addition, as I said, writes an introduction to the Talmud explaining how the Gemara works, which is no longer influential and no longer completely extant, but at the time was particularly learned. Yes.
And all these Sattler's books, were they sort of carried on from generation to generation, passed down, or did they get lost for a period? Do we know?
So each work has its own history. Some of the works we only know from fragments in the Kariates. Other works we know from references that other authors make to them who had access to them, even though we don't have access to them. Some of them are copied extensively in manuscripts, and we still have them. There's no one answer to the question. So I just gave you a summary of some of them. Some of them we literally just have fragments, or a reference from someone else to Rav Shmuel Chofni's great work on this area in 10 chapters, and we don't actually have the work at all. So unfortunately, these are very. This is very. A lot was lost. He also wrote a book on another translation and commentary on the Torah, and he's cited by later by Rishonim. He's cited by Rabbi Yonah ibn Jana, who's well known to those who are interested in grammar. He's cited by the Ibn Ezra, by more famous figures. So he's quite important. And he also, by the way, wrote he in his translation of the Torah, he was happy to he wrote on Chamisha Torah. He wrote on some of Nevi'im, some of Kesuvim. We don't have an enormous amount of knowledge about what he has, and it was somewhat based on a Saadia Gaon's commentary from earlier, though with his own tweaks. And he consulted widely. So, for example, he consulted a Catholic scholar who had various explanations about translation, and he justifies this and says, "This is, I'm allowed to do so. I'm allowed to take wisdom even from non-Jews." He is a rationalist. He quite an extreme rationalist. He again, like Saadia Gaon and on, discusses the relationship between reason and revelation, reason and tradition. What do we do when reason contradicts tradition? And arguably went quite far in this direction. So arguably, he's if we think of a spectrum of maybe those who completely deny the place of human reason and think we should just go by revelation and Torah on one end of the spectrum, the opposite end of the spectrum, completely rationalist and perhaps ruling out revelation completely. He's a Marmin, he's from Jew, and the like, but he's quite far along the spectrum of rationalism, and he thinks that a lot of things are need to be understood philosophically rather than literally. I'm talking about the story of the donkey of Bilam speaking to Bilam. I'm talking about the story of the witch of Ein Dur, where Shaul HaMelech consults a witch that brings to life Shmuel. I'm talking about the Nochash speaking to Chava. All these stories he seems to understand philosophically rather than literally, and says, snakes don't speak, donkeys don't speak, and the like. And why should we? Sometimes a miracle has some big national purpose, Yetzias Mitzrayim, but other miracles like this, why on earth should we understand it in that way? And he basically says a miracle is only to be understood in a very sparse manner. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu is choosing to intervene in history, we have to understand there's something profoundly problematic about a miracle, that God has to tweak nature in this way. And even though, and he takes this quite far, he's criticized by his own son-in-law, Rav Gaon, but he was one of the Geonim, and others. We're not talking about Kfira over here in his view, but someone who goes quite far along the direction of rationalism. And again, I just want to be careful because we're rushing through what are deep philosophical ideas. I'm not in any way suggesting that these are views that any of us should adopt here in this room without significantly understanding and learning the sugya much more. Now, he achieves recognition in halacha and in answering and clarifying various topics. The nature of the response that he receives also indicates the shifting center of gravity in the Jewish world, because no longer is he receiving questions like the earlier Geonim of just practical halacha, what do we do here, what do we do there, but he's receiving questions from, for example, Cairo in North Africa, where there's a yeshiva, and it already has a Rosh Yeshiva, who's already titling himself Gaon, Nissim Gaon. Nissim Gaon is not a Gaon in the Babylonian sense of the word. This is a Gaon in North Africa, a head of yeshiva in North Africa, and the questions they're writing are, can you explain to us this passage in the Gemara? So these are already more be'ian, these are more in-depth questions. They're not just saying, teach us a halacha in this case. They're saying, we're learning from Gemara, we're struggling to understand this Gemara. Can you explain it to us? The reason he writes an introduction to Gemara, by the way, is because there's people outside Bavel who don't have access to the yeshivas who want to learn Gemara. So if you're writing an introduction to Gemara, it's because there's a demand already. So we're seeing the shifting centers of gravity as there's more and more Jews in yeshivas outside Bavel who are learning Torah, and therefore he writes this work. We no longer have that work in answer to the question you asked, for example. We have a later work, another introduction to the Gemara, written by Shmuel HaNagid, who by now is 100 years after the Geonim, is in Spain. So the work that we have as an introduction to the Gemara isn't even Geonic, it's post-Geonic from Shmuel HaNagid. So, okay, we'll do our best to ignore that. So this is indicating the shift in the center of gravity, and it is again, in a sense, a reflection of the decline of the Gaonite and also cause of the decline of the Gaonite. It's a reflection of the decline because there are people outside Bavel who now want to learn Torah on a high level. You could say it's a success of the Gaonic project. They've succeeded in seeding Talmudism, succeeding. Don't forget, Gemara starts off as a Babylonian-centric project. Gemara is written in Bavel. If you're Jew in faraway Spain in under the Goths in the year 600, you are profound Amharetz. And you may not even accept the authority of Gemara. Your Judaism may just be your traditional Judaism that you kind of know from what you saw from your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. It's traditional Judaism. It's not Judaism where you have a concept of asking the rabbi a shaila. And there are many Jews that live like that to this day, right? You kind of do. How do you know how to keep Shabbos? How do you know how to run your kitchen? But what you saw your mother doing, and you sort of live like that. And it's a pretty good way of preserving Yiddishkeit. It has a continuity to it, but also halachic mistakes are going to creep in. It's not going to be entirely accurate. And it's not obvious to you what do the rabbis know? Like, well, I should follow some Babylonian rabbi. I do what I've always done. I do what I've done at home. And a lot of the Jewish world is living like that. And one of the big projects of the Geonim is to sort of sow Talmudic authority, particularly Babylonian Talmudic authority, amongst the population. There may be others that are following tradition, minhag, inaccurate minhag or accurate minhag, or even non-Babylonian traditions. Maybe there's still some following the incorrectly named Talmud Yerushalmi, the Eretz Yisrael tradition of the Pesach. So the Gaonim succeed in establishing the authority of Talmud Bavli throughout the Jewish world, but in so doing, yeshivas are created throughout the Jewish world, and through the latter works in which they give people Kolei HaTalmud and the like, they lose authority because now people can open the Gemara themselves and learn, and eventually people can turn and say, we're the true successors of the Gaonim. We saw when we learned Rashi, and we looked at Rabbenu Gershon Me'or HaGola, that this backwater Jewish community in the Rhine is happy to say within 5 years of the death of Rav Hai Gaon, or even a little bit overlapping his life, they're happy to say our Rosh Hashivas are gone. He's the Me'or HaGola, he's the light of the diaspora. What? You Jews living in your little community in Germany are the light of Me'or HaGola, the light of the diaspora? And the answer is yes. And Rabbeinu Gershon is going to make takonos that we discussed, and he makes legislation, and they treat the yeshiva of Mainz as a Gaonic academy. So the Gaonim have now given Klal Yisrael the tools, and that's their ultimate legacy. Yes.
The Talmud wasn't even known in Western Europe till the 10th century, which I think was about the time of the
Yes. So again, we don't exactly when it became known, but it's certainly not known en masse, and perhaps very little known. They're Amaraim, the Jews are Amaraim. And this is again what we struggle with, because it's amazing, because in the space of a century, they go from Amaraim to Rashi. I mean, it's just remarkable. Like, how does that happen so quickly? And we don't fully understand the answer to that question. Yes, Avram.
Then you know, I think I'm sure we find that 600, 800. So the Geonim happened to be there when this book called the Talmud was formed. So before that, you didn't have a Talmud that could.
So when we discussed, and we'll get back to this when we look at Rav Sherira Gaon in a moment, when we discussed the formation of the Gemara, we discussed how there's a lot that's unclear about exactly when the text of the Gemara was finalized and when it was written down. It may have remained oral for many centuries also, and there's some evidence that in the Gaonic Academy, a lot of the learning in the earlier generations is oral. The Gemara itself says, I'm going to discuss this because Rav Sherira Gaon is the source on all of this. We'll get to Rav Sherira Gaon in a moment, but the sealing of the Talmud is a process. Unlike the Mishnah, which is edited by Rabbi Nossi, kind of like that, it's one generational project. The Talmud is a much slower process, and certainly that's the case. If you don't have access to the Talmud, or if it's all oral, then you're not going to be able to learn the Gemara in anywhere apart from Bavel. But again, one of the great achievements of the Geonim is finalizing the text of the Talmud and getting it written down and spreading it. And from that point on, again, we don't know exact cause and effect, but you have the decline of the Geonit and the rise of other Torah centers. Yes.
Arguing that it was the Gemara was disseminated by the Geonim in response to his quest from the elsewhere.
Yes.
He wrote it down and sent it out.
Yes,
that
is correct. The Geonim sent out the text of the Talmud, 100%. They write it down. How early or late this all occurs is unclear. You have positions all the way through to the most extreme position is that it's really only written down in the late 800s or early 900s, as late as that. And then you have other positions that it's basically written down already from the 600s, and it's very unclear. Don't forget, in the pre-printing world, and people capable of prodigious feats of memory, and the Talmud is not longer than other texts that were orally transmitted, so the Homer Iliad, some of the sagas of Norse sagas and the like. So it could be that it was a memorized text till that point. And it could be they were still somewhat tweaking with the text. We'll see Rav Sherira Gaon on this.
They have rational basis of just the Shachar of the Gemara.
Well, again, I don't.
Unless there were someone.
No, there isn't. But this is Rashi. We discussed when we spoke about Rashi's life. There's another stage. Once the Gemara is written down, and once you have Rashi, which makes the Gemara learnable and readable, now we can have the project of the Bali Tosfos, who begin didactic reasoning and dialectic reasoning and analysis of the text and so on. So this is what leads to the flourishing of this the conceptual analysis of Gemara, which is what we know as the Bali Tosfos. But that's still several hundred years to come. So in the times of the Geonim, as the Geonit draws to a close, the reality is they have lost control of the Gemara, Baruch Hashem, like that's what was meant to be, and now there are Talmudic academies running parallel to the last of the Geonim, but the Geonim still have something to give. We still have Rav Shira Gaon to cover, and we still have his son, Rav Hai Gaon. So we're not yet closed with the era of the Geonim. They still have great contributions to make to Klal Yisrael, but more or less with Rav Hai Gaon's death, the ends of the really significant contributions of the Geonim to Klal Yisrael cease, and Bavel becomes just one other Torah center, and it's not even the most dominant Torah center. So Bavel remained till 48, and even a little afterwards, the Torah center, still from Jews there, and they still have Talmid Chachamim, and they had some Rishonim, Rav Daniel HaBavli and others, but it's no longer, it's just one amongst a family of Torah centers, and in some ways eclipsed by greater Torah centers in Spain and France, Germany. Okay, so we now get to Rav Shmuel bar Chofni's Mechutin, Rav Sherira Gaon. So Rav Sherira Gaon is the Rosh Hashiva of Pumbedita, and he's succeeded by his son Rav Hai Gaon, and he is most famous for a work of history that he wrote known as Igeres Rav Sherira Gaon, the letter of Sherira Gaon. Okay, so let's just give a little bit about his life. The headlines are going to be that in response again to a question from an outlying community from North Africa, Rav Sherira Gaon is asked by them, tell us how the Gemara came into existence. Explain to us Teresh Mitzav, Teresh Balpeh, the place of Mishnah, the place of Gemara, how Gemara developed, and he wrote a very, very lengthy answer, in which he outlines the history of much of what we sort of take for granted now, and which we've sort of begun discussing now, in which he discusses how the Talmud was sealed and how it was developed. This letter went viral. That means to say it's copied and copied and copied by authors, and it's spread throughout the Jewish world. So if you are there in faraway France and Germany, you're just as interested in the letter of Rav Sherira Gaon as your co-religionists in North Africa, and therefore you get a copy. Well, you're desperate to get a copy of Rav Sherira Gaon's letter, and we have manuscripts. We still have the letter of Rav Sherira Gaon, and we have a number of manuscript versions of it. So we have the so-called Spanish manuscript and the so-called French-German manuscript and the like. So different communities send agents and they say, we need to see this letter. We need to understand how Gemara works. Okay, so this is the great work of Sherira Gaon, but let's just talk a little bit about him. He's born some around the year 900 and dies, we can reverse engineer when we think he was born. He died in 1006. So again, we're right at the end of the Gaonic era, and by tradition, he lived for 100 years, in which case you all are mathematically able to work out that he would have been born in 906. Now, whether 100 means approximately 100 or is a convenient round number, we don't know. But when he died, people say he was 100 years old. And again, by the way, don't think here, well, people in, I don't know, Litvaks in 1880 didn't even know which decade they were born in, or we're talking about in civilized Babylonian. It's a very, very developed part of the world, so certainly they were keeping records and like, but again, whether 100 is accurate or not, we don't know. Now, he comes from a Gaonic family, from a prominent Gaonic family. He claims descent not just from Gaonim, but from the Reish Galusa's family. His family have a tradition that they descend from the Reish Galusas, in which case they are descendants of David HaMelech, but he makes it very clear he's not interested in political power. He wants to be a Talmud Chacham and he wants to learn. And he first starts off as a judge, as a Dayan, and he's later promoted to the Gaonet, and he becomes the Gaon of Pumbedita. And just to sort of summarize the rest of his life, at a very old age, when he's perhaps 90, 91, he's the Rosh Hashiva. His son is now the new Dayan. His son is the Av Beis Din, and the two of them are denounced by enemies to the Caliph at the time, to the Abbasid Caliph at the time. He's imprisoned, and his health declines. Their property is taken from them, and he resigns as Gaon, and his son Rav Hai Gaon is appointed as the new Gaon, as the new head of the yeshiva, and that's when Rav Hai Gaon, in the life of, and we can go that way just because it's distracting, if that's okay. And his son is appointed as the new head of the yeshiva, and that's where Rav Hai Gaon comes to power. Now, he writes many responsa and teshuvas back and forth. And he is not, as far as we can tell, particularly philosophically interested. We don't have philosophical writings from him. He doesn't seem to have studied Arabic literature at all, and he may not even have known that much Arabic. So he's a much more conservative. I don't want to say this in a judgmental way, but Rav Hai Gaon is considered amongst the greatest of the Geonim, but he's interested in Jewish affairs. He's not interested in broader matters. As far as we can tell, he didn't speak a great Arabic, though he did have some Arabic, and he preferred to use Hebrew or Aramaic for his responsa. And he's not he's a classic Rosh Hashiva. That's his job. He's there to teach Torah, and he's considered the last sort of shining light of the Geonim. There's even a kind of tradition around in which each era ends with a bang, with a sort of a supreme authority. So the Mishnaic era ends with Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, the Mishnaic era with Ravina and Rav Ashi, and the Gemara era with Ravina and Rav Ashi, and the Gaonic era ends with Rav Hai Gaon. So you see, in some ways he's considered the last of the Geonim, but in some respects the most influential and even the greatest of them. So he's a towering figure, but his interests are halacha and Talmud. That's what. Sorry, I slipped into talking about Rav Hai Gaon, his son. I apologize. Everything I just said was about Rav Hai Gaon. We're now talking about Rav Sherira Gaon. Rav Sherira Gaon is the father of Rav Hai Gaon, and also a towering figure. Forgive me, but interested in Talmud and in Torah. He's known. His contemporaries describe him as a very refined person, a very serious figure, a very noble figure, very personable, with great chen and charm. And he's most famous, as I said, for his Igeres, for the letter that he wrote. Now, I'm not going to go through the Igeres in detail, but basically, he is approached by Rabbi Yaakov ben Nissim, the Rosh Hashiva in Cairo in North Africa. The year is 987, and he is asked to write. He's asked by them, tell us about the development of Torah, tell us about the Mishnaic tradition, tell us about the Gemara, about the line of tradition of Tanaim and Amaraim. What is Sifra, Sifri? What are Brises? What are Toseftas? All the things that sort of, as you learn Gemara, you begin sort of being taught and told without noticing. All of this is basically the project of Rav Hai Gaon, of Rav Sherira Gaon, I'm sorry, the letter of Rav Sherira Gaon. And even though it's a letter, it's really a book. It's a very lengthy letter, and he divides it into chapters. And very briefly, as I said, we have manuscript copies of it, both the French version, or the Ashkenazi version, you can call it, and the Spanish version. And there's a lot of analysis, sort of, about how it's written and what its role was. But basically, yeah. Yeah.
Translating the Gemara, they put a volume introduction to it,
Yeah.
with the whole history, and they printed the whole.
They printed the whole of Rosh Hashanah. Oh wow, okay, so that's in the Article on Gemara series. In Brachos, where it is?
It's
Separate volume. Okay, fantastic. Okay, I didn't know that, so I would have looked at it had I known. Okay, so for those online, apparently the article has a translated version of the whole letter. Basically, they ask him, how was the Mishnah written down? Was it written down in stages, or was it all done by Rabbi Yehuda Nossi? What's the reason for the order of the Mishnah, the Masechtas, the Sadorim? Why didn't he include the other Tanaitic sources? So we basically have a number of collections of Tanaitic sources that Rabbi Yehuda Nossi didn't include, like the Brises and the Toseftas. How did he decide what to include and what to exclude? When was the Gemara written down? How was the Gemara written down? And what was the editing process, including the Savaraim, who I mentioned when we began the opening of the Gaonic period, and what was their role vis-a-vis the Amaraim. Now, what led to them writing this question? The answer is, well, they need to respond to the Karaites, and because they've got yeshiva flourishing. So if you have yeshiva, you need to understand. A lot of the confusion as Gemara is when you see different Rabbanim arguing each other, which generation do they live in, were they living at the same time, were they living at different times, and how do they interlink with each other? If you learn Gemara, it's quite confusing. It talks about different geographical locations. The Babylonians know all of these because they're the people who were there. I don't want to spend too long on his answer, other than just to briefly remind you. He says, like, the very classic stuff that we know. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi was the editor of the Mishnah. He tried to include in the Mishnah enough information that would give all the legal principles, but didn't aim to include everything. Later figures like Rav Chia, his nephew, edited other collections of Tanaitic works like the Tosefta, and he also speaks about the Chasimas HaTalmud, the sealing of the Talmud, which it tells us how the Talmud wasn't sealed in one go. but was the main debates of the Talmud were recorded and then edited. The Savaraim continued to tweak the text of the Talmud, and he lets us know even about certain parts of the Talmud which were post Amaraim, which came from the Savaraim. And again, when you learn Gemara, if you learn Baba Metzia with the Rishonim, you see the Rishonim will comment, this stuff over here is from the Savaraim, not from the Amaraim, and all of this comes from Rav Shura Gaon's works. It's hard to emphasize how important this work is, because he's basically the only source of clear information we have for this whole era, from this whole period of history, including the 500 to the year 500 to 1000, which is the Gaonic era. He lists all the scholars of the generation, all the Savaraim, all the Geonim, noting their role, their time in office, a little bit of detail, important events, takonos that they made. We wouldn't know any of this without Shura Gaon. And in a sense, everything I've been doing in this series is piggybacking on him. So he creates the structure, and he's an heir to the great tradition of the Geonim, and he gives us all these chains and names and years and so on is all really from Shura Gaon. There's been research since then, obviously, from manuscripts and from other records of filling in details, but basically Shura Gaon gave the whole structure of the Gaonic era. And again, one can only marvel at the divine providence that we have this work. It's literally written in the last generation of the Geonim, and had that not been written, all these traditions would have been lost. The Geonim were very proud of their lineage, they're very proud of their tradition. Like you go to a school, an ancient school, I don't know, Eton, and you have up on the boards etched out in sort of gold lettering on the words all the names of the head boys and the head girls and the headmasters and head teachers and the like. You have a tradition that's about to decline into near obscurity, but they have very, very strong records of, if you're the Rosh Hashiva of Sura Pumbedita, you know all your predecessors and you're very proud of them. And because of Rav Shura Gaon's letter, we have all that history. And had that not been recorded, the Gaonit is going to come to an end, and Eton's going to shut down. There's not going to be these records are all going to be lost. So this is a remarkable piece of historical hashgacha or luck, depending on how you're theologically inclined. Okay, so that's Rav Shura Gaon, and as I said, Rav Shura Gaon is writing in Aramaic, and he is writing to North Africa. But then his works get copied, and they are copied into Spain, and then copied into France. Okay, now we come to Rav Hai Gaon, and I got a little mixed up in my order. It's Rav Hai Gaon who's considered, of course, this blaze of glory, and in a way the last of the Geonim, and yet the greatest, and the seminal figure who closes the era of the Geonim. I want to emphasize there are still some little bit of Geonim after Rav Hai Gaon, but they use the title Gaon. They're still Rosh Yeshivas of the old yeshivas in Bavel, but they are no longer figures that the rest of the world is engaging with as with awe. They're now just one yeshiva amongst many across the Jewish world. Okay, so Rav Hai Gaon we know a lot about. He's born. He born in 939, the son of his very famous father Rav Shura Gaon, the son-in-law of the less famous but important Rav Shmuel bar Chofni Gaon, and dies in 1038. He's a Talmud of his father Rav Shura Gaon, and assists him initially. Then when his father is appointed to the Gaonate, he becomes the Av Beis Din, the head Dayan, and eventually in the life of his father, because of his father's decline in health due to the imprisonment, he succeeds and takes over as the last of the Geonim, and he basically overlaps with the first of the Rishonim, if you like. So just to remind ourselves of dates, he dies, Rav Hai Gaon dies in 1038. Rabbeinu Gershon Me'or HaGola, who is in a sense an Ashkenazi Gaon, you can call him that, because he lives in the era of the Geonim and he's Rosh Hashiva of a Babylonian-type academy in faraway Ashkenaz. Rabbeinu Gershon is 960 to 1040, so he basically is a contemporary of Rav Hai Gaon. Now, Rabbeinu Gershon, Me'or HaGola, is the teacher of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Eliezer Halevi and the teacher of Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, who are the teachers of Rashi. So again, quick plug for those who don't remember it, listen to the online recordings of our series on Rashi. But he's overlapping with the first of the non-Babylonian scholars of world-class importance. And roughly a couple of generations before Rashi. Rashi, of course, was born in 1040, so he dies in 1038, and Rashi is born in 1040, which makes Rashi more or less 2-3 generations after him. Generations, if we treat a generation as roughly 20 to 30 years. He's also more or less a contemporary of Rabbenu Chananel, who many of you may have heard of, who again is in North Africa and a very important Rishon. He's a contemporary, more or less, of Rabbenu Nissim Gaon, who, even though he has the title Gaon, isn't what we would call a true Gaon. He's the Rosh Hashiva of Karun. So he's overlapping with the first of the great leaders outside Bavel, the first generation of really senior Talmudic scholars outside Bavel. He is appointed as Gaon, as I said, in the lifetime of his father. And again, it's difficult to gauge the stature of the person. It's hot. People are crazy over him. The level of esteem and awe he promotes in his contemporaries is just beyond belief. The language used about him is again, we might be inclined to say, well, everyone always reveres their teachers, everyone always reveres their Rosh Hashivas, and there's truth in that. But even within that, you can see sometimes just how amazed people are by a figure. And again, we don't know the authority of all of this, but by tradition, on the Shabbos that after Shmuel Gaon's death, they change the Parsha Hashavua, and they read the Parsha of Yehoshua being appointed by Moshe as his successor. Remember the glowing Pesukim where Hashem tells Moshe the qualification for his successor, Isha Sherach and a Kimbo, he has to be someone, amazing language used about Yeshua. And that's the Parsha they read. And then in the Haftorah, they read the story of Shlomo HaMelech taking over from David HaMelech. And according to tradition, they changed the last pasuk. And instead of the pasuk saying that Shlomo sat on the throne of David, his father, and his kingdom was firmly established, they say Rav Hai sits on the throne of Sherira Gaon, his father, and his kingdom is established. So again, it's hard to know the historicity of these stories, but again, classically, they don't tell stories about you and me like that. So these are people are in awe of Rav Hai Gaon and people that knew him. So again, the first generation of Rishonim know him and know of him. Figures like Shlomo ibn Gabirol and Rabbenu Shmuel HaNagid, who wrote the other introduction to the Talmud, they're contemporaries of him, and they write poems about him. It's just they're just blown away by who he is. And we've never done Shlomo ibn Gabirol in the Shayam of Shmuel HaNagid, so maybe at some point we'll do them. I had the privilege of when I was in Spain in the summer, we did this road trip of Rishonim to going to their locations. We can still see the palace that Shmuel HaNagid lived in. It's amazing what there is. Okay, so what is Rav Hai Gaon's claim to fame? There's a last blaze of glory. He is masses of correspondence from the communities around to Rav Hai Gaon, and on a much higher level, because they have now become sophisticated centers of Torah. So the very thing that leads to the decline of the Gaonate, which is, or is linked to the decline of the Gaonate, which is the flourishing of Torah around the world, also means that in the last generation of the Gaonim, the level of correspondence is much higher, because these are serious figures writing to him. These aren't a bunch of forgive me, of Amaraim in Viscoth, Spain in the 700s who don't know anything asking the Geonim Shilas. These are figures in Germany, in France, in Spain, in North Africa, and even as far as India and Ethiopia, who are writing letters to Rav Hai Gaon, and these are high-level correspondence because these are Rishonim stature, Rosh Yeshivas who are writing to him. We have more than 800 teshuvos preserved from him, so it's just astounding his influence. And he also wrote various halachic works. He wrote a work on mortgage, on mashkan. He wrote a work on terms and conditions, making a tanai in a sale. He writes on sales and transactions. Very, very important works, which are published, by the way. They've been printed, so these are in print. The manuscripts survived, and others didn't. He wrote a work on neighbor disputes, planning permission, basically, known as Meitzronot, which we only have quotes from. We don't have the original, and he wrote works on more ritual things like Hilchos Tefillah and the like. He wrote a parish on Mishnayos, which is important, and he also perhaps wrote a commentary on the Torah. We don't know, which is partially quoted by Ibn Ezra and others. He wrote a type of dictionary, possibly, in which he groups works according to the alphabet, which is an innovation. Again, we take these things for granted, but someone had to think of the idea of listing works in alphabetical orders, and he does that, and he writes He writes many other important works. Unlike his father of Sherira, he is familiar with Arabic works. He's familiar with the Quran. He's familiar with the Hadith. He's familiar with Plato and Aristotle and the Septuagint and the Greek calendar and everything else. So he's one of these polymaths that the Geonim produced. And I got mixed up again in my order. As I said, he even consults non-Jewish scholars and justifies his willingness to do so. He says, you have to accept chokhmah from wherever it comes from. He's competent to argue philosophically with the Kalim. We mentioned the Kalim that Gaon was very influenced, the sort of Muslim tradition of theology. And he's sort of part of that sort of Gaonic culture. He's also, though, a traditionalist in the sense that he says we should follow minhag even when we don't understand it. We should take some of the Agadata warnings of the Gemara seriously, even though we don't understand it. For example, there's a halacha that, other than Hasidim, I think very few people keep nowadays, mentioned in the Gemara that certain times of astronomical seasonal shifts, the tzukufas, one shouldn't drink water and the like. It's mentioned in the Gemara. Rav Hagon writes about that and says we should keep that even though we don't understand any of this stuff. We're rationalists. We don't know what sense to make of it. He's a very strong leader. He reinforces faith. He's happy to put people in Chayim and the like. And he's also quite cautious about the study of philosophy. So even though he himself does study philosophy, he's not like Rav Sadigan, for example, who's gung ho about philosophy. He says, look, the main you have to know a bit of philosophy. You have to know, certainly we all have to know, for example, against anthropomorphisms, not to take the physical descriptions of Hashem seriously, but don't learn too much philosophy. Our main work needs to be in Torah and in halacha, and that's what we should focus on. Okay, we're running out of time, so I just want to conclude with mentioning that Rav Haigon, is one of the important figures who closes the Gaonic era. He dies, as I said, in 1038. He's 99 years old, and we know the accuracy of his birth. It seems he came from good genes. His father, as I said, apparently lived to 100. Rav Haigon, we know much more detail about his life, and he lives till 99, and writes, as I said, many major halachic works, which we still consider to study this day, Shai, Shavuos, and so on. His legacy, in the sense, in terms of seeding Torah, is that he has students who go on to flourish elsewhere. He is, in a way, the Rebbe of Rabbenu Chananel, of Nissim, the head of the yeshivas in North Africa, and thus oversees the transmission of Torah to the Rishonim. He is followed by Rav Chizkiah Gaon, who is the last Gaon of Pumbedita. Unfortunately, only reigns for 2 years. He himself comes from a very distinguished dynasty. He succeeds Rav Haigon, who died, as I said, at 98, 99. And unfortunately, within 2 years, he is imprisoned and killed. So an era of persecution now dominates, and with that, basically, the Gaonic era comes to an end. I just want to mention a couple of the transition figures who we've spoken about. We mentioned Rabbenu Nissim. Rabbenu Nissim himself is a student of Rabbi Yaakov ben Nissim. He's a student of Rabbeinu Chushiel, and he has a student known as Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, Rabbi Yitzchak from Fez, better known as the Rif. So we're now entering into the sort of famous Rishonim of whom we are aware. And I mentioned Rabbeinu Chananel ben Chushiel. So Rabbeinu Chananel is a student of, again, this Rabbeinu Chushiel, and he wrote a short commentary on the Gemara, printed on the side of the text of the Talmud, on the Vilna edition. Rabbeinu Chananel, when you learn Gemara, you see on the side the parish of Rabbeinu Chananel, and that's still learned to this day. These are, again, transition figures, and so on and so forth. I want to conclude with the famous legends of the four captives, and with this we will finish. As I mentioned already, the flourishing of Torah across the Jewish world is a mystery. What seeded it? And there's an ancient tradition that somewhere in the year 960, there are 4 great Babylonian rabbis traveling in the Mediterranean, perhaps on a fundraising mission, and they are captured by pirates and sold on the slave markets. And we even have a tradition that tells us their name: Rabbenu Shmaria, Rabbenu Chushiel, Rabbenu Moshe ben Chanoich, and one other who we don't know. And they're infested. The seas are infested by piracy, and they are captured and sold. And the pirate chief realizes that these are not going to make good. These are learned rabbis. They're not going to make good field workers. They're not going to make good housekeepers. They're not going to be fit for other purposes. But they're Jews, and he travels to the Jewish communities. And in Egypt, Rabbeinu Shmaria is ransomed for a vast sum of money. In Cairo, in North Africa, in Tunisia, Rabbenu Chushiel is ransomed, and Rabbenu Moshe is ransomed in Spain, in Cordova, and each of them become prominent rabbinic leaders in those locations and set up yeshivas and teach Torah, and thus each of these locations become promising Torah centers. Now, it's a story, it's a legend. We don't know the truth of the legend entirely. It explains to some degree how Torah suddenly spread, because suddenly these locations found themselves with preeminent Torah authorities. Again, I want to emphasize it's not really enough to explain the full flourishing of Torah, because you can't just have a great figure turning up and changing the place. If I can use an analogy of America becoming a Mokum Torah, it's not as if Moshe Feinstein and Aaron Kotler turn up in America and suddenly America has Lakewood and these vibrant Torah centers. There's groundwork laid for 100+ years in America before that can take off. And history is unfair, but this is the reality of history. So you have Jews, immigrants arriving in America, a vast population builds up. The first generation of immigrants, poor immigrants working in Schwitz factories, can't set up yeshivas. They don't have the money for it, they don't have the time for it, and they're like, gradually the American community becomes richer. Learning is seeded. You have Rabbonim who are fighting to raise standards of kashrus, of shechita. There's profound amaratzis. There's correspondence back and forth, right? America's not just the golden Medina, it's the treif Medina. Everyone there who goes there goes off. Eventually, with hard work, figures that none of us have even heard of, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, who has given his name to a yeshiva, that they're fighting to get shechita established. They're trying to. Sorry. Dies penniless and in shame, right? Here in the UK, by the way, the same things are happening, right? Figures so there's generations of hard work put forward till you establish a basic tier of learning, till you establish respect for Rabbonim, till you establish learning balabatim who are willing to dig deep into their pockets to fund yeshivas. And then you have a figure like Rav Aaron Kotler who can come along and set up a Lakewood yeshiva, and suddenly you have this vibrant Mokum Torah. So we don't know any of these unsung heroes, other than the name of one, and with this I will finish. When we were touring Provence, we came across, there was a Babylonian businessman called Mochir, who moved to Provence somewhere around the year 800, and was a supporter of Torah. We don't know exactly why he moved, for commercial reasons or other reasons. He was a supporter of Torah and funded Torah scholars, and he was certainly one of the great Balabatim who created the atmosphere that was ripe for Talmud Torah. And you can visit his house, which has been preserved remarkably. There's still a coat of arms, either his house or his family house. So it was the house known as the house of the Mechiri. He had descendants, the Mechiri, and you can visit his house and see there's still a plaque on the wall, as it were, not the coat of arms on the wall of the Mechiri. And this is one of the great figures who was one of these Balabatim who he may have been somewhat learned, somewhat not, we don't know exactly, but he certainly wasn't a Rosh Hashiva or Talmud Chacham who established the founding of the Torah elsewhere. So when I went to visit his house, I was exceptionally moved, because we were seeing the home of someone who really the whole Torah that we have in Rashi and Tosfos and through Chaim Brisk and everything, the whole flourishing of Torah in the Ashkenazi world, which came through Provence and then into North France and then into Germany through different routes. He was one of the great seminal figures of that transmission of Torah, and with that we conclude the Gaonic era, and we've now started the era of the Rishonim. I'll come back to it in a moment. I left it vague for once because I was struggling to remember. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, online and live, we'll finish with this. I'm open for nominations of great thinkers and the time. So any suggestions as to other figures for us to look at, I'm happy and open to do. Thank you so much to everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoyed.